everywhere. So we're looking at Exodus, the 14th chapter. I understand that you've kind of been looking at this the last few weeks, and we continue the story today. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, the minds of Pharaoh and his officers were changed toward the people, and they said, "What have we done, letting Israel leave our service?" So he had his chariots made ready, and he took his army with him. He took 600 picked chariots and all the other chariots of Egypt, with officers over all of them. As Pharaoh drew near, the Israelites looked back, and there were the Egyptians advancing on them. In great fear, the Israelites cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "What has become? Why? Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us, bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not the very thing we told you in Egypt? Let us alone and let us serve the Egyptians. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." But Moses said to the people, "Do not be afraid, stand firm and see the deliverance that the Lord will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to keep still." Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. The Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night, and turned the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. The Israelites went into the sea on the dry ground. The waters formed a wall from them on their right and on their left. The Egyptians pursued and went into the sea after them, all of Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and the chariot drivers. At the morning watch, the Lord and the pillar of fire and the cloud looked down upon the Egyptian army and threw the Egyptian army into panic. He clogged their chariot wheels so that they were turned with difficulty. The Egyptians said, "Let us flee for the Israelites, for the Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea so that the water may come back upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots and the chariot drivers." So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at dawn the sea returned to its normal depth. As the Egyptians fled before it, the Lord tossed the Egyptians into the sea. The waters returned and covered the chariots and the chariot drivers, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed them into the sea. Not one of them remained, but the Israelites walked on dry ground through the sea. The waters formed a wall for them on their right and on their left. The gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
Woo! What a story, huh? Familiar stuff, though, right? Familiar stuff. Today we see the Israelites as refugees. The United Nations defines refugees as someone who has been forced to flee his or her country because of persecution, war, or violence. 25.4 million people have fled their homes in the world today. The number of displaced people in the world today has never been higher. Think about that. Isn't that amazing? We think about World War I and World War II, Cambodia and Vietnam and Cuba and the Baltics and all those things. And today we have more displaced people in the world than we've ever had before. One of the problems is also not only the number of people, but the reaction to these refugees, and refugees finding support for their lives. It's countries like Jordan and Turkey that are taking in more refugees. It's not the wealthy countries like Western Europe or America. These countries are more and more creating laws and difficulties to bring refugees in. So today we see, even in biblical times, this problem of refugees, this problem of people leaving their country and having no home. You know that they had left. Right, last week we talked about this, when they had escaped from Egypt and they were in the wilderness. We don't know how long they were there. It may have been days or weeks or months. But now we read this story today. I'm trying to imagine the joy that they must have felt when they first escaped Egypt. And I wonder what that must have been like. Most of us have no clue what it's like to be a slave, or even heard stories in our family about being slaves. But some of us have, and have those stories within our families. Solomon Northup wrote a book called 12 Years a Slave. And he wrote this book before the Civil War. And he said this about slavery. Oh, how heavy the weight of slavery pressed upon me then. I must toil day after day, endure abuse and taunts and scoffs, sleeping on the hard ground, living on crusted fare, and not only this, but live the slave of a blood-seeking wretch, of whom I must stand heretofore in continued fear and dread. Later on in the book he says, really, it was more difficult for me to determine if I should be more afraid of the dogs or the alligator or of men. This was the stuff of being a slave. This was the state of the Israelites as they had left the promised land. We can only imagine the joy that they must have experienced to be free and no longer under that deep, difficult burden of slavery. About 1,000 years later, Martin Luther King stood in Washington at the march there. And he said this in his speech. When we allow freedom to ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's creation, black men and white men, Jewish and Gentile, Protestant and Catholic, we will all be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual. Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last. Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech and his vision for the world. A vision of the world that is no longer racist or sexist, where color or creed didn't matter. In a world where the laws were equal for every man, for every woman. Like Martin Luther King, we all have dreams of our country and of our world. I don't know about you, it's been kind of a rough week in our country and in our world. We've heard a lot. And we've heard of women coming forward and talking about abuse. And we've heard from others that abuse didn't happen. We've heard of disasters and difficulties and more refugees. And we perhaps have had a bit of joy as we've seen a man being prosecuted and going to prison for treating women in such a way. It's a time to celebrate, and it's a time to be challenged. And as we look at our politics and our government, and as we look at the world, we struggle and wonder what might be happening. We may have some of those struggles in our own life as well, with our families, our relationships, with our health, with whatever it might be. We find ourselves sometimes in struggles. It's interesting to think about the Israelites and the joy that they celebrated, and now we see that Moses has moved them over toward the sea. There are mountains on this side and there are mountains on that side, and there's the Egyptian army in the middle. Right? They're trapped. They're trapped. And the people complain and they say, it would have been better for us to remain slaves. Can you imagine? To remain slaves and die out here in the desert. And Moses said to them, stand firm. Be still. Stand firm. God's salvation is coming. Just when they thought things were good, now they've been trapped in a difficult situation. It's interesting to me that Moses stands up before the people before he has a conversation with God. Right? And he says, stand firm to the people. God's going to deliver us. So Moses has some faith, right? And then it's funny that Moses goes to God, and God says, why are you crying to me? So I imagine Moses kind of laughing. Well, look at the situation here, right? We're doomed. This is awful. We have no place to go. We are trapped. And then God gives Moses the command to save the people and help them along the way. Moses says, stand firm. We look at that term, stand firm, and we see it. And I think we've experienced it even this week as we read the newspapers and watch TV. Stand firm means to refuse to change a decision or a position. To hold firm to our faith. To stand up in what we believe in our values. In the Supreme Court hearings, Judge Kavanaugh, Professor Ford, and President Trump are all standing firm in what they believe about the situation and what they've said and what they're talking about. But maybe Moses and God are saying things a little bit different about this stand firm. I like the King James Version here that reads, and Moses said to the people, do not be afraid, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish in you today. He doesn't say, go get your arms and fight. He doesn't say, run and hide. He says, stand still. Stand still. As some of you know, I'm a chaplain for Optimal Hospice. And that means I work with families and patients that are seriously ill and who are at the end of their life. And they can be with us sometimes for years or 6 months or so. I want to tell you one about a story about Bob, who had Parkinson's disease. And over the years, his body became stiffer and stiffer, and the tremors became worse and worse, despite the medications and treatments that he had. And Bob was very frustrated with his lack of mobility, and his speech became soft, and it was difficult for him to even talk or to be a part in community, he felt. When he came on the hospice, he was frustrated. And we talked a lot about that frustration. And he talked about the strides that he had made and feeling better and dealing with day to day the illness that he had dealt with. And we prayed for him and prayed for his family. And as time went on, Bob began to change a bit. And instead of being frustrated, he began to think about his family, his wife, and his children. And he called his children in one at a time, and his wife, and wanted to speak to them and share his love with them. He asked for forgiveness, and he forgave them. He said thank you to them, and he said goodbye to them. At the end of his life, he was peaceful, and he had been changed. He was frustrated with his illness, and he struggled with his illness. And he came to points where he felt really good and points where he felt really bad. But those high points he celebrated and had great joy. And those down points he was really down. He shared that those times that he was up, he thought that's the way it was going to stay. But the time of downness came. Perhaps like the Israelites today, they experienced great joy and they felt trapped. But then he began to become still and look for God's salvation. When we're going through troubled times, and as we look around in our world today, we think of refugees, we think of persecution, we think of the oppressed, we think of our own lives and our own struggles. God says to us to be still, to be at peace. His salvation is here. God opens up the seas, and the Israelites left for safety. And eventually they got to the promised land, and they knew great joy. God brings that joy to us as well, whatever our situation and wherever we are today. May God bless us as God's people. Amen.